They locked him in solitary confinement. He dug his way out 13 times. Most men would have broken after the first month. After the second, they would have surrendered to madness. After a year, they would have forgotten what freedom tasted like, what sunlight felt like on skin that hadn't seen it except through iron bars. But Flight Lieutenant Bill Ash was not most men. He was, by all reasonable psychiatric standards, completely insane. And that insanity would save his life. Before we dive into this story of impossible determination, hit that subscribe button. Because if Bill Ash could survive 467 days in solitary confinement, you can survive clicking one button. And trust me, you'll want to see how this story ends. Though I'll warn you, it involves more tunnels than a mole convention and significantly less common sense. He was a prisoner of war, a tunnel rat, a man who turned suffering into defiance, who converted darkness into opportunity, who looked at concrete walls and saw only temporary obstacles between himself and the sky. The Germans called him unbreakable. His fellow prisoners called him unstoppable. The camp psychiatrist, yes, they sent him to one, called him a fascinating case study in pathological optimism. This is the story of 467 days spent mostly underground, of 13 escape attempts that would make Houdini look like an amateur with commitment issues, of a man who refused to stop fighting even when his own body became his prison, when common sense screamed for surrender, when even the guards started rooting for him just to see if he'd actually pull it off. And it begins, as all great escapes do, with a crash. March 24th, 1942. The sky over France was a canvas of smoke and tracer fire, a deadly painting being composed in real time by men who measured their lives in seconds. Flight Lieutenant Bill Ash, a 23-year-old Texan flying for the Royal Canadian Air Force, pressed his Spitfire into a steep dive, chasing a German bomber through clouds that offered no shelter, only momentary concealment. He'd volunteered before America entered the war, crossed into Canada, lied about his flying experience, claiming he had hundreds of hours when he'd barely managed to not crash during training, and somehow learned to pilot a fighter aircraft through sheer stubborn will and what his instructors charitably called aggressive incompetence that occasionally resembled skill. Now, 9 months into his combat service, he'd become something more than the farm boy from Dallas. He'd become a hunter, a killer, a man comfortable at 20,000 feet, where the air was thin and death was always one mistake away. He'd also become supremely confident in his abilities, which is generally when the universe likes to remind pilots that gravity doesn't care about confidence. The German bomber filled his gun sight. His finger tightened on the trigger. 8 303 caliber machine guns opened up, their tracers drawing lines of fire across the French sky. Then something hit his plane. Not anti-aircraft fire, not another fighter. Something far more embarrassing. A mechanical failure. The reliable Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that had carried him through dozens of missions suddenly decided to retire early, without notice, and with extremely poor timing. Smoke filled the cockpit. Not the clean smoke of engine exhaust, but the thick, toxic smoke that says, your very expensive aircraft is now a very expensive falling object. Bill Ash had perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision. Stay with the plane and try to coax it back to England across 100 miles of channel and occupied territory. A journey that even with a working engine was optimistic. Or punch out. Become a parachutist. Become a target hanging helpless in the sky. Become, essentially, a very slow clay pigeon for German gunners. He chose the parachute. It seemed like the less stupid option at the time. The Spitfire's canopy flew away. The wind hit him like a physical blow, tearing at his flight suit, ripping the oxygen mask from his face. He yanked the ejection handle and the seat kicked him clear, tumbling through space, the ground and sky trading places, in a dizzying rotation that answered the age-old question. Yes, you can vomit while free-falling. And yes, It goes everywhere. His parachute deployed with a crack that jerked his spine. Sudden silence. No engine roar. No gunfire. Just the whisper of silk and the terrible knowledge that he was descending into enemy territory with no weapon, no plan, and no illusions about what awaited him below. He landed in a ploughed field outside Abbeville, his ankles taking the impact badly, one twisting with a sickening pop that sent lightning up his leg. Before he could gather the parachute, before he could run, well, limp dramatically, they were on him. German soldiers, Wehrmacht infantry. Young men with old eyes, carrying rifles that looked far too large in that moment, pointed at his chest with the casual certainty of men who'd done this before. Hände hoch, hands up. Bill Ash, who'd spent 9 months hunting German aircraft, who'd shot down 5 confirmed kills, who'd thought of himself as a warrior, raised his hands like a criminal, like a prisoner, like a man whose war had just become significantly more inconvenient. They took him to Luft, the Luftwaffe's interrogation center near Frankfurt. A place designed to break men not through torture, though that was always implied, but through psychological pressure, through isolation, through the systematic dismantling of identity, until all that remained was a registration number and a willingness to talk. The irony was that Bill Ash didn't know anything worth torturing him over. He was a pilot. He knew how to fly a Spitfire, how to shoot at things, and how to not die most of the time. The Germans probably had better intelligence from captured flight manuals than from his brain, but they didn't know that, so they tried anyway. Bill Ash was assigned a solitary cell, 6 feet by 8 feet, a wooden bunk, a bucket, which served multiple purposes, none of them dignified, a single barred window that looked out onto a concrete courtyard where nothing grew, where nothing lived except the occasional guard and the more frequent rats. The rats, at least, had the good sense to leave when they wanted to. The Luftwaffe interrogators were polite, almost friendly. They offered cigarettes, hot coffee, sympathetic nods, when he gave them only his name, rank, and serial number, as prescribed by the Geneva Convention. "We already know everything, Lieutenant Ash," the interrogator said. "His English perfect. Probably learned at Oxford or Cambridge before the war. We know your squadron. We know your aircraft. We know how many missions you've flown. Why make this difficult on yourself?" Bill Ash stared at the wall and said nothing, mainly because if he opened his mouth he might point out that if they already knew everything, this conversation was a waste of both their time. And antagonizing German interrogators seemed like poor long-term planning. The interrogator sighed. "You Americans, always so dramatic. Very well. You can sit in your cell and think about cooperation. We have time, all the time in the world." But Bill Ash wasn't thinking about cooperation. He was thinking about escape. Specifically, he was thinking that a 6x8 cell with a wooden floor was basically an invitation. The Germans might as well have left a shovel and a map with a dotted line reading, "Dig here for freedom." The cell had a wooden floor. Beneath the floor, there would be dirt. Beneath the dirt, if he dug deep enough, there would be freedom. Or at least, the possibility of freedom. Or, more realistically, there would be more dirt, then clay, then probably rocks, then maybe some ancient Roman ruins. And eventually, if he was very lucky and very patient, freedom. And Bill Ash had discovered he possessed reservoirs of patience he'd never known existed. Also, stubbornness. Mostly stubbornness. He began that first night, using a metal spoon he'd palmed from his single meal. The spoon was supposed to be for eating the watery soup they called food. Bill Ash decided it would serve humanity better as a mining implement. The soup, frankly, wasn't worth eating anyway. The wood floorboards were old, warped from moisture and temperature changes. With patience, and Bill Ash had discovered he possessed reservoirs of patience he'd never known existed, he could pry one board loose. The sound of scraping wood was hidden by coughing, by shifting his weight, by humming, badly, The few German songs he'd learned from listening to guards, which probably sounded like someone torturing a cat, but served the dual purpose of covering noise and annoying the Germans. It took 3 nights to remove a single board. 3 nights of backbreaking work for one piece of wood. At this rate, he calculated, he'd be out by 1947. But he was committed now. Sunk cost fallacy and all that. Beneath it, packed earth, clay mixed with gravel. The foundation of the building, pressing down with the weight of German efficiency. Bill Ash began to dig. With a spoon. With his bare hands. With a piece of broken pottery he found in the exercise yard. He dug during the day, when guards were less attentive. He dug at night when darkness was his ally. He moved the excavated dirt into his pillowcase, then distributed it during exercise periods, letting it drift from his pockets, from holes in his trousers, creating small piles that rain would disperse, that wind would scatter, that guards wouldn't notice unless they were looking. And they weren't looking. Not yet. German efficiency, it turned out, didn't extend to checking whether prisoners were gradually relocating the camp's foundation one spoonful at a time. The tunnel progressed an inch at a time, 6 inches in a good night. A foot, if he was lucky. And the clay was soft, and his fingers didn't bleed too badly. He breathed stale air that tasted of earth and rot, and his own terrible decisions. He crawled through spaces barely wide enough for his shoulders, pushing dirt behind him like a mole, like something born to live underground, like something that had forgotten what sunlight was and no longer cared. After 3 weeks, his tunnel had reached beyond the cell wall, beneath the exercise yard, heading toward the perimeter fence 50 feet away. It was perhaps the most audacious thing he'd ever attempted. More dangerous than combat. More terrifying than being shot down, because this required sustained effort over weeks and months, required believing in a future that might not exist, required ignoring the voice in his head that kept asking why he didn't just wait for the war to end, like a normal person. Then they found it. A routine cell inspection. A guard noticed the loose floorboard, probably because Bill Ash had gotten cocky and stopped being as careful about replacing it. Pulled it up, discovered the tunnel entrance, and stood there for a solid minute, just staring at the hole, probably wondering how much paperwork this was going to generate. Within an hour, Bill Ash was standing in front of the camp commandant, still covered in dirt, his hands bleeding, his face showing not shame, but something closer to pride. The kind of pride that says, yes, I did that. And I'd do it again, and we both know I'm going to. You will spend 30 days in solitary confinement, the commandant said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. The kind of rage that comes from realizing a prisoner had been digging under your camp for 3 weeks and you never noticed. And then you will be transferred to a permanent camp where such foolishness will be impossible. Bill Ash smiled. Just slightly. Just enough to let them know he wasn't bitten. Just enough to be incredibly annoying. I'll start digging the day I arrive, he said. It wasn't bravado. It was a promise. A threat. A guarantee that Flight Lieutenant William Ash was going to be the most inconvenient prisoner they'd ever had the misfortune to capture. The commandant's face went purple. Get him out of my sight. As guards dragged him away, Bill Ash couldn't help but think, 1 down, 12 to go. At this rate, he'd be the most escaped and recaptured prisoner in German history. They'd probably write books about him. He was right. They did. And we'll get back to Bill's increasingly concerning relationship with tunnel digging in just a moment. But first, if you're enjoying this story of a man who looked at escape-proof and thought challenge accepted, smash that like button. It helps the algorithm understand that people enjoy stories about pathologically optimistic prisoners. Also, leave a comment telling me, would you have kept digging after the first failed attempt? Or would you have decided that maybe the Germans had a point about security measures? and Stalag Luft III. The name would later become synonymous with the Great Escape, the mass breakout of 76 Allied airmen through a tunnel called Harry, an operation so ambitious it would inspire books and films and legends. But that was still 2 years away. When Bill Ash arrived in April 1942, Stalag Luft III was still being constructed, still evolving from a temporary camp into what the Germans believed would be an escape-proof facility. They'd learned from previous camps. They'd studied every escape attempt. They'd hired engineers. The barracks were raised on concrete stilts to prevent tunnelling. Guard towers ringed the compound every 100 yards, searchlights sweeping the grounds every few seconds. Seismograph microphones were buried around the perimeter to detect underground digging. It was a fortress designed by men who'd studied every escape attempt from every camp in Europe, a prison built by experience and German engineering precision, a facility that essentially said, "Go ahead, try to escape. We dare you." Bill Ash looked at it and saw 13 different ways to get out, possibly 14 if he squinted. The Germans had made one critical error. They'd assumed prisoners would be discouraged by security measures. They'd forgotten that to men like Bill Ash, security measures were just puzzles, challenges, invitations written in barbed wire and concrete. He joined the escape committee immediately. This was standard practice among Allied POWs, a coordinated effort to plan, execute, and support escape attempts, to turn individual desperation into organised resistance. The committee assigned resources, created forged documents, manufactured civilian clothing from dyed uniforms, and decided who would go and when. Bill Ash volunteered for everything. "Ash is here for tunnel duty," the committee chairman announced. "I'll do it," Bill Ash said. "We haven't told you what it is yet." "Doesn't matter. I'll do it. It might be suicidal." "Even better. When do we start?" The committee chairman looked at him with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You know, most prisoners try to survive the war." "I am surviving," Bill Ash replied, "just very actively." His second tunnel began in the washroom, beneath the drainage grating. It made it 20 feet before a guard literally fell through the entrance during a routine inspection. The guard was fine. The tunnel was not. The look on the guard's face as he plunged into an unauthorized hole was, according to witnesses, absolutely priceless. The third started under his bunk, identical to his first attempt, but with better shoring and ventilation. This one made it 40 feet before the seismographs picked it up. Bill Ash was actually impressed. The Germans had good equipment. Annoying, but good. The fourth, fifth, and sixth were collaborative efforts with other prisoners, elaborate affairs with electric lighting scavenged from the barracks, air pumps made from kit bags, and disposal systems that moved tons of excavated sand through the camp, like a very slow, very illegal logistics operation. Each tunnel was discovered. Each attempt ended in recapture, usually within hours of breakout. And each failure sent Bill Ash back to solitary confinement, where the guards were starting to recognize him by name. "Ash? Again? Again. Which tunnel this time? Lost count. 5? 6? It's 7. Is it? Time flies when you're digging." The guards sighed. "You know, there are easier ways to spend a war." "Yes, but they're boring. The punishment cell was worse than anything at Stalag Luft. 8 feet by 4 feet. No windows. A stone floor. A wooden board for sleeping. Meals consisting of bread, water, and occasionally a thin soup that tasted like dishwater, and offered roughly the same nutritional value. Bill Ash suspected it might actually be dishwater. The Germans were efficient about recycling. In darkness, time becomes meaningless. without sunlight to mark days, without variation in routine to indicate hours, the mind begins to drift, to fracture, to seek escape through madness, since physical escape is impossible. Bill Ash developed a routine. Because if you're going to go insane, you might as well do it on a schedule. Exercise, push-ups, sit-ups, squats, anything to keep his body functional, to prevent the muscle atrophy that came from confinement. He counted reps, 100 push-ups, 200 sit-ups, squats until his legs trembled and threatened to collapse. He did this in complete darkness, occasionally misjudging distances and hitting his head on walls, which was painful, but at least broke up the monotony. Mental exercise. He would recite poems memorized in school, solve mathematical problems in his head, complex equations, geometric proofs, anything to keep his mind sharp. He created imaginary chess games, playing both sides, developing strategies that would have impressed grandmasters. He was fairly certain he was losing to himself, which was concerning, but at least it was entertaining. Tunnel planning, even in solitary, even in darkness, even while doing push-ups and playing chess against himself and reciting Shakespeare badly, he was planning the next attempt, mapping the camp in his mind, calculating distances, imagining routes. When they let him out, and they always did eventually, he would be ready. The guards started taking bets on how long until his next attempt. The over-under was set at 3 weeks. Bill Ash made it 2. "Ash, you were supposed to wait at least a month," the guard said when they caught him starting tunnel number 8 in the latrine. "Sorry," Bill Ash said, not sounding sorry at all. "I got bored." "You've been out of solitary for 2 weeks." Like I said, bored. After his 7th escape attempt, the Gestapo got involved. This was not an improvement. They were different from the Luftwaffe guards, harder, crueler, less bound by the Geneva Convention's niceties about officer prisoners, less likely to see the humour in a prisoner who'd attempted to escape more times than most people had tried to quit smoking. They beat him in ways that wouldn't leave permanent marks: kidneys, stomach, the soles of his feet, professional work. They clearly had training. Bill Ash tried to be impressed by their technique while also being in excruciating pain. They put him in the cooler, a concrete box barely large enough to stand in, for days at a time. They couldn't break him. Not because Bill Ash was superhuman, not because he was immune to pain or fear, but because he'd discovered something fundamental about himself during those months underground. He was more terrified of giving up than of dying. The thought of surrendering, of accepting imprisonment, of admitting defeat, that was worse than any beating, any solitary confinement, any punishment the Germans could devise. Also, spite. Never underestimate the power of pure, stubborn spite. Every time they beat him, every time they locked him up, every time they told him to stop, he became more determined to keep going. It was probably unhealthy. It was definitely irrational. But it worked. So he kept digging. Tunnel number 8 was discovered during construction. Number 9 made it 20 feet before a seismograph detected the digging. Number 10 collapsed, nearly killing 2 of his fellow diggers, filling their lungs with sand and leaving them trapped for hours until rescuers could dig them out. Bill Ash visited them in the infirmary afterward. "Sorry about that. Ash, your tunnel nearly killed us. But it didn't. That's a win, right?" No, that is not a win. I'm counting it as a win." Bill Ash was undeterred. By this point, escape attempts weren't even about getting out anymore. They were about making a point, about refusing to be defeated, about being so annoying that the Germans might eventually just let him go out of sheer exhaustion. "You are insane," a fellow prisoner told him after his 11th recapture. They're going to kill you eventually, or you'll die in a tunnel. Just stop. Bill Ash looked at him with eyes that had seen too much darkness, that had spent too much time underground, that reflected something beyond stubbornness, something that might have been madness, or determination, or both. "I'd rather die trying to escape than live as a prisoner," he said quietly. "Every tunnel I dig, every attempt I make, that's a day I'm not defeated. That's a day I'm still fighting. And if I stop fighting, I might as well be dead already." Then he paused. "Also, I think I'm close to the record for most escape attempts. Would be a shame to stop now." The other prisoner had no answer to that. You can't argue with someone who's turned imprisonment into a competitive sport. By the summer of 1943, Bill Ash had spent a cumulative 467 days in solitary confinement. That's more than 15 months, more than a year of his life in cells measuring 8x4, 8x6, 10x10 if he was lucky. More than a year breathing stale air, eating starvation rations, existing in a twilight world between life and death. The guards had started a chart tracking his time in solitary. It was posted in the guardhouse. Bill Ash was weirdly proud of it. His body showed the strain. He'd lost 40 pounds. His teeth were loose from malnutrition. His hands were scarred from digging, the fingernails blackened and broken, the palms calloused in ways that would have made a coal miner nod with recognition and, possibly, offer career advice. But his mind remained sharp, focused, unbroken, possibly deranged, but in a very focused, determined way. Tunnel number 12 was his masterpiece. It started in the theatre. Yes, the Germans had allowed the prisoners to build a theatre for morale purposes, not realizing they'd essentially installed an escape hatch with entertaining musical numbers. The Germans were very thorough about security, less thorough about thinking through the implications of letting prisoners build things. The stage had a trap door for props. Beneath the trap door, Bill Ash and 3 other prisoners dug straight down 20 feet below the seismograph detection range, then angled toward the fence. "How far down do the seismographs reach?" someone asked. 15 feet, Bill Ash replied. "And we're going to 20? Better safe than sorry." That's rich coming from you. They worked in shifts. 1 man digging. 1 man hauling dirt back in a canvas bag attached to a rope. 1 man pumping air through a tube made from condensed milk cans, which was ingenious engineering and also explained why the camp had suddenly run out of condensed milk. 1 man standing watch. They used stolen tools, a trowel, a chisel, a coal shovel shortened to fit the tunnel's narrow dimensions. The tunnel took 6 months to complete. 6 months of daily work, of near misses, of close calls, of guards walking over them while they held their breath and prayed the shoring would hold and nobody would sneeze. It extended 150 feet, the longest tunnel in Stalag Luft III to that point. It had electric lighting powered by illegal taps into the camp's electrical system, which technically made them electricity thieves in addition to escape artists. It had shoring made from bedboards, carefully removed and replaced so inspections wouldn't notice. It was an engineering marvel created by men with no engineering training, using tools that barely qualified as such, in conditions that would make actual engineers weep. If they'd survived the war and gone into construction, they would have built the best damn buildings in history, or the most elaborate ones, or possibly both. Quick pause while Bill plans his 13th tunnel, because of course he does. If this story has taught you anything about the power of stubborn determination, or if you're just impressed by someone who treated imprisonment like a competitive sport, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. I cover more stories of people who refused to quit even when quitting was the only sane option. which probably says something concerning about my content choices. But here we are. On October 14th, 1943, Bill Ash and 7 other prisoners entered the tunnel for the final time. They crawled through 150 feet of darkness, their shoulders scraping the walls, their breath labored in the thin air despite the ventilation system. They could hear the guards above them, walking their patrols, their boots crunching on gravel. They could feel the weight of the earth pressing down, the constant awareness that a cave-in could bury them alive, that they could die just feet from freedom. And wouldn't that be embarrassing after all this work? The exit shaft went up at a 45-degree angle, ending, they hoped, in a grove of trees beyond the fence, beyond the searchlights, beyond German authority. Bill Ash went first, naturally. He'd dug more tunnels than anyone. He'd been in solitary more than anyone. If anyone deserved to be the first out, it was him. Also, if the exit was wrong and they popped up in front of a guard tower, better him than someone with better sense. He pushed up through the final few feet of dirt, his hands breaking through into cold October air. He emerged like something being born, covered in dirt, gasping, his eyes adjusting to moonlight that seemed impossibly bright after months of tunnel darkness. He was out, beyond the fence, free, for approximately 4 minutes, which might have been a new personal record for shortest freedom period. The tunnel exit was 15 feet short of the tree line. 15 feet. They'd measured wrong, or the maps were wrong, or the Germans had moved the trees. Or possibly the universe just had it in for Bill Ash specifically. It opened in clear ground, illuminated by searchlights, visible to every guard tower within 200 yards. They'd basically emerged onto a stage, spotlit, ready for their dramatic recapture. A shout. "Halt!" Bill Ash ran. Not toward the trees. There wasn't time. Not back into the tunnel. That would trap the others. He ran along the fence line, hoping for shadows, hoping for confusion, hoping for a miracle that had sustained him through 13 escape attempts and had so far failed to actually produce freedom, but had at least kept him alive. A guard dog caught him. The dog, at least, seemed happy about the whole situation. Probably broke up the monotony of guard duty. Then soldiers. Then fists and rifle butts and the familiar journey back to solitary confinement. This time with a Gestapo officer promising that this would be the last time, that they'd had enough of Flight Lieutenant William Ash and his tunnels. "We've been hearing that since Tunnel 3, Bill Ash muttered. "What was that?" I said, "Thank you for your hospitality." They put him in the deepest cell, the darkest, the smallest. A concrete box 6 feet by 4 feet with a ceiling so low he couldn't stand upright. No windows. No light except when they opened the door to throw in bread and water. The bread was stale. The water tasted like rust. It was like a 1-star hotel, but underground and without the amenities. They left him there for 90 days. 90 days in darkness. 90 days of sensory deprivation. 90 days where the only sounds were his own heartbeat, his own breathing, his own mind slowly fragmenting under the weight of absolute isolation. 90 days to think about his choices, his life, his determination to keep digging holes like the world's most committed mole. Most men would have broken, would have emerged insane or catatonic, or so fundamentally changed that they'd never recover. Bill Ash emerged planning tunnel number 13, because of course he did. The final escape attempt came in January 1945. By then, the war was clearly ending. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. Allied forces had broken through in France and were pushing toward Germany. The end was visible on the horizon, a matter of months rather than years. Rational prisoners were counting days until liberation. Bill Ash was counting feet until the fence, but Bill Ash couldn't wait for liberation. Couldn't sit in a cell while freedom was digging itself toward him. He had to be the one doing the digging. It was a compulsion at this point. A habit, an addiction to digging holes that would have concerned mental health professionals, if any had been available. Also, he'd come this far. 13 was a better number than 12. Had a nice ring to it. 13 escape attempts. Unlucky for the Germans, hopefully lucky for him. Tunnel 13 started in the latrine, the most unpleasant location possible, which made it the least likely to be discovered. Nobody wants to inspect a latrine too closely. It was genius, really. Disgusting genius, but genius nonetheless. It was a solo effort this time. Bill Ash working alone, digging at night, breathing air fouled by human waste, crawling through filth that would have made most men vomit. He'd been in worse places. Most of them were also tunnels he'd dug. He didn't care. This was his last chance, his final attempt before the war ended and his captivity became a footnote in history rather than a defining struggle. His last opportunity to prove that he was, in fact, the most escaped and recaptured prisoner in German records. The tunnel took 3 weeks. It was crude compared to his earlier efforts. No lights, no shoring, barely wide enough for his shoulders. But it worked. It reached beyond the fence, beyond the wire, ending in a drainage ditch 50 yards from the nearest guard tower. On the night of January 27, 1945, Bill Ash crawled through his 13th tunnel, emerged into winter darkness, stood on German soil as a free man for the first time in nearly 3 years. He walked, not ran. Running attracted attention. He walked like a civilian, like someone with purpose and destination, like someone who definitely wasn't a recently escaped prisoner covered in latrine filth, through the German countryside in the middle of winter. He had no coat, no food, no map. Just the North Star and a determination that had survived 467 days in solitary confinement and 13 failed escape attempts. Also, he smelled terrible, but that was probably helping his disguise. Nobody wanted to get close enough to question him. He made it 40 kilometers before exhaustion and hypothermia forced him to seek shelter in a barn. 40 kilometers. That was farther than any of his previous attempts. Progress! The farmer found him the next morning, nearly frozen to death, and, being German, being law-abiding, being probably concerned about the smell, called the authorities. They brought Bill Ash back to Stalag Luft III, but this time, something was different. The guards were nervous, distracted. The camp commandant looked at him with something approaching respect rather than rage, or possibly exhaustion. It was hard to tell. "You are either the bravest man I have ever met, or the most foolish," the commandant said. "Perhaps both." Bill Ash said nothing. He was too tired to be witty, also freezing, and still smelled like a latrine. "The war is ending, Lieutenant. You know this. We know this. You will be liberated within weeks. Why did you attempt to escape now?" It was a fair question, a reasonable question, the kind of question a sane person would have asked themselves before digging through a latrine floor. Bill Ash looked at the commandant with eyes that had seen too much darkness, that had spent too much time underground, that reflected something the German officer couldn't understand, something between madness and principle, something that made sense only if you'd spent 467 days in solitary confinement and decided that spite was a valid life philosophy. "Because I'm a prisoner every day, I don't try to escape," he said simply. "And I'd rather die free than live in a cage, even for one more day." He paused. "Also, 13 is a better number than 12. The commandant studied him for a long moment, probably wondering if they should add psychiatric evaluation to his file. Then he nodded. "Return to your barracks. There will be no punishment this time. I think you have been punished enough." As Bill Ash left, he heard the commandant mutter to his aide, 13 escape attempts. 13. Do you know how much paperwork that is?" Stalag Luft III was liberated by Soviet forces on April 29, 1945. Bill Ash walked out of the camp on his own 2 feet, emaciated, scarred, his hands permanently damaged from years of digging, his lungs weakened from breathing bad air in enclosed spaces, still vaguely smelling like a latrine. But he walked out, on his own terms, unbroken, possibly unhinged, but unbroken. He returned to America, to Texas, to a world that had moved on while he'd been living in holes and cells. He married, raised children, became a successful businessman, lived a long, full life that extended decades beyond his captivity, never dug another tunnel. His wife was very clear about that, but he never forgot the tunnels. In interviews later in life, reporters would ask him why he'd kept trying, why he'd risked death, torture, execution. Why he couldn't just wait for liberation like most prisoners, like normal people, like people with common sense. His answer was always the same. Every tunnel was an act of resistance. Every escape attempt was a refusal to accept defeat. They could lock me up. They could beat me. They could bury me in solitary confinement. But they couldn't make me stop fighting. As long as I was digging, I wasn't defeated. And that mattered more than success or failure. Then he'd usually add, also, I was probably a bit mad. Solitary confinement does that to you. 13 tunnels, 13 escape attempts, 467 days in solitary confinement. A lifetime spent proving that the human spirit cannot be imprisoned as long as it refuses to surrender, or as long as it has access to a spoon and an alarming amount of free time. Bill Ash died in 2014 at the age of 96, having outlived his captors, his prison, and the regime that tried to break him. He died free. He died knowing that every day of his captivity had been a victory because he'd never stopped fighting. He also died knowing he held the unofficial record for most annoying prisoner of war, though that wasn't in the official citations. And somewhere, in the records of Stalag Luft III, in the archives documenting Allied prisoners of war, his name appears more than any other in the escape attempts ledger. 13 entries. 13 failures that were really triumphs. 13 times that Flight Lieutenant William Ash looked at walls and saw doors, looked at floors and saw freedom, looked at the impossible and said, "Let me try anyway." One former guard, interviewed decades later, was asked about Bill Ash. The old man laughed, shook his head, and said, "That crazy American. We should have just let him go after the 5th tunnel. Would have saved everyone so much trouble. But we were German. We couldn't let anyone escape. It was the principle of the thing." He paused. Though honestly, by Tunnel 9, we were sort of rooting for him. They locked him in solitary confinement. He dug his way out. 13 times. Most men would have broken after the first month. Bill Ash wasn't most men. He was certifiably insane, pathologically optimistic, stubbornly determined, and absolutely, completely, thoroughly unwilling to admit defeat. He was a tunnel rat, a freedom fighter, a man who proved that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's digging through darkness with bleeding hands, believing in a light you cannot see, refusing to surrender even when surrender is the only rational choice. His war lasted 1,087 days in captivity, but he was never truly captured, because the part of him that mattered, the part that dreamed of sky and freedom and home, was always digging, always escaping, always free. And that's the part they could never imprison, though they certainly tried, repeatedly, with increasing exasperation. So what's the point of Bill Ash's story? What are we supposed to learn from a man who spent 3 years digging holes that led nowhere, enduring punishments that would break most people, refusing to quit even when quitting was the only sane option? Maybe it's this. Success isn't measured by outcomes. It's measured by effort. the choice to keep trying when trying seems pointless, by the refusal to surrender even when surrender is rational. Bill Ash failed 13 times, but he succeeded in something more important. He proved that the human spirit cannot be imprisoned. That determination is more powerful than walls. That hope, however irrational, is worth fighting for. Or maybe the point is simpler. Some men are just too stubborn to quit. And sometimes that stubbornness is exactly what the world needs. Not because it leads to victory, but because it inspires others. Because it shows what's possible when you refuse to accept limitations. Because somewhere, right now, someone is facing their own impossible situation. Their own locked cell. Their own seemingly unbreakable prison. And they need to know that breaking free is possible. Those walls are just obstacles. That giving up is optional. And if they can't escape, if they try 13 times and fail 13 times, at least they'll know they tried. At least they'll know they didn't surrender. At least they'll know that they were, in their own way, never truly captured. Because the most important prison isn't made of concrete and wire. It's made of resignation and despair and the acceptance of defeat. And Bill Ash spent 1,087 days proving that some men can't be kept in that prison. No matter how hard you try, no matter how many times they fail, no matter how many tunnels collapse, or how many times they're caught, some men just keep digging, even when it's insane, especially when it's insane. Because insanity, in the right circumstances, looks a lot like courage. They locked him in solitary confinement. He dug his way out 13 times. And every single one of those failures was a victory. Somewhere, in whatever afterlife exists, Bill Ash is probably examining the cloud foundations and asking the angels if they've considered the structural weaknesses in the pearly gates. The angels are nervous. God is taking precautions. Nobody wants a repeat of the Stalag Luft situation. But Bill Ash? He's just getting started. So there you have it. The man who escaped 13 times and proved that some people just can't be kept down. If this story inspired you, frustrated you, or made you think that guy needed therapy, let me know in the comments below. And if you want more stories of impossible determination and questionable decision-making, subscribe to the channel, because history is full of people like Bill Ash, people who looked at impossible and started digging. Sometimes, literally. Hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear about stubborn courage, and I'll see you in the next video.